on a freezing February morning in 1934. A grand mansion stood above the Missouri hills like a misplaced European castle rising from the American Midwest. Behind its thick, imposing walls, built to inspire awe and power, a man was losing a battle no amount of money could win. His body had been failing for months, worn down by heart disease, gout, dropsy, and relentless pain that turned every passing hour into a struggle for breath. He had survived Prohibition. He had carried a brewing empire through an era that should have destroyed it. He had watched his family name rise into one of the most powerful brands in the nation. Yet, in that bedroom, none of it mattered anymore. Just after 8 in the morning, his chauffeur entered the room as he always did and turned on the radio, hoping music might break the heavy silence. A moment later, a single gunshot shattered the stillness. It was not a sound of celebration. It was the sound of surrender. August Anheuser Busch Senior, president of the largest brewing company in America, had ended his own life with a pearl-handled revolver. Beside him lay a short note, not a dramatic confession, or a detailed explanation, only a farewell to the people he loved. Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children. 2 words were underlined, as if he wanted them to be the last thing the world remembered about him. Precious. Adorable. This was not the ending people associate with dynasties. The world prefers its wealthy families to appear untouchable, gliding through history in polished shoes and perfect photographs, never breaking in ways ordinary people recognize. But that gunshot inside that bedroom was the first clue to what Grant's farm truly represented. The Busch family estate was never just a mansion. It was an altar to ambition, a fortress built on land already soaked in American myth, and a place where triumph and tragedy took turns shaping its legacy. The property carried a name that did not belong to the Busch family at all. Grant's Farm. A name tied to a man who would become President of the United States, but who first lived on that land, not as a hero or symbol, but as a struggling farmer fighting stubborn soil and relentless misfortune. It was a place where the American dream looked fragile and desperate before it ever looked grand. The mansion sat at the intersection of 2 American stories that seemed impossible to reconcile. One was a story of failure, bankruptcy, and humiliation. The other was a story of immigrant success, so massive it reshaped the nation. When those stories collided, they did not erase each other. They stacked together like layers in a wall, creating a legacy that could never escape the weight of what came before. To understand why death echoed through that house in 1934, the story must go back far beyond the mansion itself. It must return to where the Busch family journey truly began. Across the Atlantic, in a small German village called Castell, in a family that understood trade, discipline, and ambition long before America ever learned their name. In the summer of 1839, a boy was born into that world, Adolphus Busch, one of 20. 2 children raised under a father who demanded education and drive from his sons. Adolphus grew up surrounded by the mechanics of business, learning early a lesson many never learn: power does not come to those who wait, but to those who pursue it relentlessly. At 18, in 1857, he left Germany, boarded a ship, and headed toward the United States. He arrived in New Orleans and traveled up the Mississippi to St. Louis, a city alive with German immigrants and the restless energy of expansion. He arrived with little money and no powerful connections. but with a mind trained to recognize opportunity and a hunger that made poverty feel temporary. His early years were humble. He worked as a clerk on the riverfront, watching cargo move, watching money move, studying the true mechanics of American commerce. When his father died and left him a small inheritance, he did not spend it. He invested it. He partnered with another German immigrant and started a business selling brewing supplies, hops, malt, and equipment. The unglamorous backbone of beer. St. Louis was filled with small breweries, serving the German population. And every brewery needed supplies, whether it succeeded or struggled. Adolphus was not just selling ingredients. He was building relationships with the people who controlled a thirsty market. That strategy led him to August Anheuser, a successful soap manufacturer who had taken over a failing brewery. The beer was not yet remarkable, but Anheuser had something Adolphus wanted: access, influence, and a gateway into brewing itself. In 1861, Adolphus married Anheuser's daughter Lily in a double ceremony, where his brother married Lily's sister. It looked like romance, but it was also strategy. Almost immediately, the Civil War erupted, and Adolphus enlisted in the Union Army, gaining discipline and confidence that would shape his future. After the war, he returned to St. Louis with a clear goal: stop being an immigrant and start being an owner. He joined his father-in-law's brewery and transformed it, not just by improving the beer, but by reinventing how beer could be sold in America. Most breweries at the time were local. Beer spoiled quickly, limiting how far it could travel. Adolphus refused to accept limits that could be engineered away. He embraced pasteurization to stabilize beer and pioneered refrigerated railroad cars to transport it across vast distances. It was not just innovation. It was revolution. He was building a national brewery in an era when most people still thought in terms of towns and villages. In 1876, he introduced a lighter, crisper beer, inspired by Bohemian Pilsners, and named it Budweiser, after the town of Budweis in the Czech lands. He used Old World symbolism and flipped it into an aggressively American identity. Not a beer for kings, but the king of beers. By the time the company became Anheuser Busch and Adolphus rose to president, the empire was already unstoppable. By 1901, the brewery had become the largest in the United States, producing over 1 million barrels a year. Adolphus Busch was no longer a riverfront clerk. He was one of the richest and most influential businessmen in America. He lived like it. Mansions in St. Louis, California, and New York. Travel that resembled royalty more than commerce. Generosity that built museums, funded relief efforts, and impressed the public. He maintained strong ties to Germany, even building a villa named after his wife. He conquered the American dream so completely that he could decorate it with European elegance. But wealth was not enough. Men like Adolphus sought permanence. They wanted their names anchored to the land itself, something that would outlive products and profits. That desire led the family to a piece of Missouri countryside already marked by the struggles of another ambitious man. Long before Budweiser, long before Prohibition, a young officer named Ulysses S. Grant had been stationed near St. Louis in the 1840s. He visited a plantation called White Haven, owned by the Dent family, a land shaped by beauty, ambition, and the brutal economics of slavery. Grant fell in love with Julia Dent there and proposed under a tree on that property. Their romance existed inside a darker reality, because the land was sustained by forced labor. Even America's love stories carried shadows. Grant married Julia and received 80 acres as a gift, a fragile step toward independence, and the beginning of a farm that would one day lend its name to a dynasty built on beer, ambition, and tragedy. He resigned from the army in the 1850s and pursued what America demanded of every man: to be a provider, a landowner, a self-made farmer. He built a cabin with his own hands and named it Hardcrabble, a name that sounded almost like a joke, but proved to be prophetic. Grant struggled. Crops failed. The weather crushed his efforts. He sold firewood in St. Louis to survive, standing in the cold with a future that looked nothing like destiny. Eventually, he moved back toward White Haven. Then the Civil War drew him back into uniform, this time to become one of the most important Union commanders, and eventually the 18th president. Hardcrabble remained standing, a rare relic of a famous man's ordinary suffering. After Grant's presidency, the story turned darker. He became entangled in a Wall Street scheme, lost everything, and in the desperation to pay debts, he signed away his beloved Missouri property. Grant died in 1885, bankrupt, just days after finishing the memoirs that would save his family financially and secure his name permanently in American legend. The land passed through other hands until 1903, when the southern portion was purchased by the Busch family, not as a museum, not as a patriotic tribute, but as a private kingdom. It was bought by Adolphus Busch for his eldest son, August Anheuser Busch Senior. August Senior had grown up within the empire. He understood brewing not as an abstract business, but as both craft and machine. When he received the property, it was intended to be a retreat hunting, horses, family gatherings, a place to breathe outside the city. He did not stop there. He wanted a statement. He wanted a palace that could compete with the grand estates of Europe and prove that the Busch family belonged not only to industry, but to American aristocracy. Construction began in 1910. Architects and planners were hired who knew how to build for spectacle. The mansion that rose was French Renaissance revival, inspired by the chateaus of the Loire Valley, but adapted with a heavier, more restrained sensibility. Red brick replaced pale stone. Ornamentation was less delicate, projecting strength rather than frivolity, power rather than playfulness. It was enormous, 3 stories over a full basement, more than 24 rooms, 14 bathrooms, spaces designed not for ordinary living, but for hosting, impressing, and turning private life into a stage. Inside, features were chosen like trophies. Tiffany-stained glass depicted hunting scenes. A gunroom displayed trophies from around the world. Floors shifted between oak, walnut, and marble. Art celebrated the American West, signaling that even as the family built a European castle, they still wanted to be seen as frontier conquerors. The mansion, completed in 1913, cost an astonishing sum for its era and stood as one of the grandest private homes in the Midwest. August Sr. and his wife Alice moved in, and for a moment, the family seemed to have reached the perfect balance: old world elegance, new world wealth, a palace built on presidential land, a dynasty anchored to history. Then, in the same year, the patriarch passed away. Adolphus Busch died in Germany, and his body was returned to St. Louis, where immense crowds lined the streets to mourn him. The funeral was more than grief. It was proof of status, a public recognition that this immigrant had entered the nation's elite. August Sr. inherited leadership of the company during a period when being German in America had become dangerous. World War I triggered waves of anti-German sentiment. The heritage that had once been an asset became a liability. An even larger threat followed, one indifferent to nationality, but obsessed with morality, politics, and controlled prohibition. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, it was meant to destroy the brewing business in the United States. Hundreds of breweries collapsed silently. Jobs disappeared. Families lost everything. August Senior refused to surrender. He forced Anheuser Busch to evolve, producing malt syrup, baker's yeast, ice cream, soft drinks, corn products, refrigeration equipment. It was not glamorous. It was survival strategy. And it worked. The company endured 13 long years of legal drought, waiting for the repeal of the amendment. In December 1933, Prohibition ended. The brewery was ready. The first legal cases rolled off the line, a moment that should have marked the triumphant climax of August Senior's life. The man who carried the empire through the storm finally had reason to celebrate. Yet the human body does not heed business victories. By then, August Senior's health was collapsing. Pain was constant. The family had already absorbed another fear familiar to wealthy dynasties. Visibility attracts predators. In 1930, his 13-year-old grandson had been kidnapped at gunpoint. Held for hours, he returned alive, but innocence does not return easily. The family realized that no fortress, no matter how grand, could keep them entirely safe. By early 1934, August Senior could not endure any longer. Heart disease, swelling, and the slow humiliation of a body turning against itself had drained him. Perhaps the exhaustion of carrying an empire through moral warfare was too much. In the mansion built as a monument to success, he chose control where it still remained. He took a revolver and ended his life. The coroner's jury met at the mansion, and the verdict was simple suicide due to long illness. No scandal, no mystery, just the cold recognition that suffering can crush even the strongest of men. Thousands mourned senators, brewers, people who understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. August Senior left instructions for his burial. He did not wish to lie with his parents in the Grand Mausoleum. He wanted to be placed within sight of Grant's farm, close to the estate he had built. Even in death, he clung to the land, as if it could hold him. The mansion fell quiet. His widow moved into a smaller cottage. The big house sat like a locked room filled with echoes, opened only occasionally for gatherings. Its halls still carried the memory of that morning. The gunshot had snapped everything in half. Slowly, another figure emerged at the center of the story, a man who had stood at his father's funeral, whose personality was almost the opposite of the quiet suffering that had ended August Senior's life. A man who would bring glamour back to the estate while also dragging new storms into its walls. August Busch Jr., known to everyone as Gussy, was born in 1899, raised inside privilege. Gussy never behaved like someone trained to be cautious. Where his father was methodical, he was bold. He craved attention, action, animals, hunting, fast cars, beautiful women, and, above all, the idea that life was meant to be lived loudly. During Prohibition, while the older generation focused on survival, Gussy mastered sales, charm, and the art of turning business into spectacle. When Prohibition ended, he delivered one of the most brilliant marketing moments in American business history. A wagon pulled by 8 Clydesdales delivering beer to the White House, a symbol of a nation stepping out of darkness into celebration. The presidency of the company did not come to him immediately. That role belonged to his older brother. Gussy waited, observed, and built his influence. He served in World War II, worked at the Pentagon, earned honors, and remained unmistakably himself, the man who carried jokes and swagger even into military service. When his brother died in 1945, Gussy finally assumed leadership. Under his reign, Anheuser Busch became a kingdom with a flamboyant king. Yet the mansion at Grant's Farm still carried echoes of pain. For a time, Gussy avoided the big house where his father had died. The memories were too heavy, the silence too sharp. It would take someone new to reopen its rooms and breathe life back into them. That person appeared not in St. Louis, but in Switzerland. In 1949, Gussy entered a family restaurant in Lucerne and met a young hostess named Gertrude, called Trudy. She was 22, blonde, radiant, and smiling with a warmth that softened the room. Gussy was captivated instantly. He stayed, talked, and ran up a large tab, not to show off, but to buy time. By the evening's end, he had asked her out. By the date's end, he proposed. There was one obstacle: Gussy was still married, though estranged. He courted Trudy across an ocean, sending letters, gifts, and promises, offering her not only wealth, but a role as the lady of an American dynasty. In 1952, after his divorce was finalized, Gussy married Trudy. She was 25, he was 53. The age gap did not matter. What mattered was the energy she brought, and she used it to revive Grant's Farm. Trudy insisted the big house be reopened. The locked rooms were cleaned, restored, and decorated. The mansion, once a shrine to death, began to resonate with life again. Parties, flowers, and guests returned, and under Trudy, the estate entered its most glamorous era. Celebrations rooted in German tradition honored the family's immigrant origins while displaying American dominance. Staff received bonuses. Champagne flowed. Harvest festivals echoed with folk songs. Grant's Farm became a place where power came to pay respect. Presidents, dignitaries, and celebrities visited. The estate transformed from a private retreat into a royal court. Gussy, a natural showman, was not content to keep the kingdom private. In 1953, he purchased the St. Louis Cardinals, saving them from relocation and linking the Busch name to baseball royalty. Owning the team meant owning a piece of the city's soul, a platform to turn beer marketing into culture. In 1954, he opened portions of Grant's Farm to the public for free, understanding the rare power of accessibility. Thousands visited, riding trams, feeding animals, marveling at a landscape that blurred Missouri farmland with a global menagerie. Bavarian-style courtyards, timber, framed architecture, stork statues for luck, Clydesdales housed like sacred creatures, buffalo beside zebras, camels, kangaroos, deer parks. A private ark of wonder. Grant's Farm became more than a mansion on a hill. It became an experience, a public stage for a private dynasty. Under Gussy, Anheuser Busch grew larger than ever. Budweiser dominated. The Cardinals won championships. St. Louis embraced the family like local royalty. For a time, it seemed the Busch family had solved the oldest problem in American wealth. How to wield power without inviting hatred. How to enjoy wealth without isolation. Gussy opened the gates and let the public in to taste the fantasy. In return, the public forgave much. Yet the shadows never left. They simply waited. Tragedy struck in a way wealth could not soften. His youngest daughter, Christina, born when he was already an older man, became the center of his heart. In 1974, She died in a car accident at 8 years old. The loss shattered him. The man who had always seemed too large to break suddenly became fragile. Depression followed. Alcohol dulled the pain, but it brought erratic behavior, worrying those around him not only for his grief, but for the empire it imperiled. In 1978, Trudy requested a divorce. Decades of marriage ended, leaving the mansion that had once rang with glamour to absorb loss faster than anyone could clear it. Betrayal followed, at least in Gussy's eyes. Alarmed by his behavior, the board of directors moved to remove him from leadership. His heir, August Busch Senior, was positioned to replace him, a palace coup inside a beer empire. Gussy, devastated, retreated to Grant's farm like an exiled monarch. Wandering the estate that had once been his theater, now haunted by the ghosts of the life he could no longer hold. The big house had seen tragedy before, and darker moments would continue. In 1976, Gussy and Trudy's son Peter was in the mansion with a friend, David Lear. A loaded revolver discharged recklessly, ending a young life instantly. Peter claimed the gun went off as he tossed it onto the bed. Investigators noted details that made the story feel questionable, but the outcome was clear: a boy had died, and the consequences landed lightly. Peter was charged with manslaughter, pleaded guilty, and received probation, no jail time. A young life ended, yet the weight of accountability was almost invisible. David Lear was buried. Peter moved on with his life, later receiving a profitable distributorship. To observers, it was another example of a pattern that would follow the Busch dynasty for decades: death, legal entanglement, and outcomes softened by power. Gussy lived 13 more years after being forced out of the company. He married again, this time to his secretary Margaret, who became the first woman on the company board. Her sudden death left him alone once more. In 1989, Gussy passed away at Grant's farm at 90 years old. His will revealed the complexity and bitterness that still lingered beneath the polished family image. He left symbolic items, instructions about art and possessions, and to his eldest son, the man who had taken his company, almost nothing. A single golden telegram passed down through generations served as a final message. He had taken the throne, but not the blessing. After Gussy, the big house became less a home and more a symbol, a venue for gatherings. A quiet monument to a dynasty that had peaked and begun to fracture. The family story continued, shifting into a modern darkness defined by speed, addiction, and scandal. Gussy's grandson, August Busch Senior, grew up with the expectation that he would one day lead the empire. He had the charisma and looks expected of an heir, but also recklessness that made him fascinating and dangerous. In 1983, at 20 years old, he left a bar in Tucson with a young woman named Michelle Frederick. Driving his Corvette fast along a curve known for accidents, the car flipped. Michelle was thrown from the vehicle and killed. What made the story darker was what followed. August fled the scene, did not call for help, and returned home. Police later found him injured and disoriented. Signs of alcohol were present, empty beer cans littered the car, and investigators pieced together the scene. The case dragged on. Lawyers fought evidence collection. Time passed until toxicology became irrelevant. Authorities ultimately declined to press charges due to insufficient evidence. Another young life vanished into the shadow of wealth. 2 years later, August was involved in another incident, a chase with undercover officers, which ended quietly. Despite it all, he continued rising through the company, shaping marketing campaigns and becoming heir in practice as well as in name. In 2006, he became chief executive, the last Bush to run the company their ancestor had built. Then came the ultimate defeat, not in a bedroom, not in a car crash, but in a boardroom. In 2008, InBev moved to purchase Anheuser Busch for billions. August fought the takeover, but the board, including his own father, agreed. Over a century of family ownership ended. The empire that began with an immigrant stepping off a boat passed into foreign hands. The Bush family remained wealthy, but the crown was gone. In 2010, another death struck August's orbit. His girlfriend, Adrienne Martin, was found dead in his bed. Lethal levels of drugs were in her system. The death was ruled accidental. Lawsuits followed, settlements were paid, and no criminal charges were filed. Another tragedy, another set of questions, another outcome that seemed to outsiders like the world treated this dynasty differently. Through all of it, Grant's farm remained standing. That is what makes this mansion so extraordinary. It outlasts the men who built it, absorbing a century of ambition, triumph, and tragedy like a sponge. It shifts identities without ever shedding the weight of what happened inside. It has been a private palace and a public attraction. It has hosted presidents and tourists, heard laughter in ballrooms and gunshots in bedrooms, witnessed fortunes surge and ownership slip away. Today, visitors still arrive at Grant's farm. Children feed baby goats. Tourists photograph the Clydesdale stables. The Bavarian courtyard still evokes an imported village. Deer parks hold animals that transport visitors into a curated world. Nearby, Hardcrabble still stands, the cabin Grant built before he became a legend, a reminder that history is never neat. A future president struggled on this land and lost it. A German immigrant family purchased it and built a castle, only to watch their own tragedies unfold beneath the same sky. In 2017, parts of the family acted to secure the farm's future, preserving it as an attraction and maintaining it as a place where the public can touch a piece of American mythology. The big house remains private, not a permanent residence, but a venue, a symbol, a backdrop for weddings and special events. Couples now exchange vows in rooms built as monuments to empire, once marked by death. Guests toast in hallways haunted by grief. Photographers capture smiles under ceilings that once listened to gunshots. Past and present coexist in the same space, separated only by the human capacity to forget what a building remembers. Standing on the land and looking up at the mansion, one can feel the pressure of all the stories layered into it: immigrant ambition, presidential hardship, prohibition, survival, public generosity, private collapse, love and divorce, death by accident, death by gunshot, death by overdose, corporate betrayal. Corporate defeat, a dynasty that gave America its most famous beer, its most recognizable symbols, and a reminder that wealth cannot shield the human heart. That is the final truth behind the Grant's Farm Mansion. It was built to prove the Bush family had arrived, to anchor them to American history, to celebrate success. And yet, again and again, it became a stage for what success cannot conquer: suffering. August Anheuser Busch Senior did not build that bedroom expecting it would become the place. He died by his own hand. Gussy did not reopen those halls imagining they would become a palace of loss. The heirs who grew up under that roof did not foresee that privilege, while protecting them, would also isolate them, pushing them into a world where consequences felt optional and tragedy inevitable. The mansion still stands. The gates still open to the public sections. The horses still parade. Tourists still smile. And behind the private walls of the big house, in rooms most will never see, history remains, not as a tidy narrative, but as a long echo. Grant's Farm reminds anyone who listens closely that the American dream, when stretched into a dynasty, often casts a shadow long enough to cover a mansion.